Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final week of the EOAS Departmental Colloquium series on intersections with the climate crisis. So this week's discussion will be on the climate emergency and us. We have invited 5 speakers to participate in our panel who are all particularly well suited to comment on EOAS's roles and responsibilities, given their multifaceted positions as researchers, educators, UBC citizens, and mentors. So with that said, I'd like to welcome our speakers. I'm just going to give a quick little who they are. So we have Professor Andrew Weaver from the EOAS department at UVic, and also a former leader of the BC Green Party.
And an alumnus from UBC EOS. I got my PhD there in 1987.
Amazing. Okay, cool. And then also Professor Claudia Rutenberg from the Department of Education Studies at UBC. And then we have Professor Tara Vanchko, who is the director of the Environmental Science Program in EOAS, and also the academic director of UBC Sustainability Initiative, now called the Sustainability Hub. And then we have John Madden, who is the director of Sustainability and Engineering with the UBC Campus and Community Planning. Is there something on my, oh, okay. And then we have Michelle Marcus, who is an alum from UBC Environmental Science Program, and also an activist who co-led the fossil fuel divestment campaign and co-chaired the UBC Climate Emergency Task Force. So welcome everyone, we're super excited to have you here today. So each week of the climate series has provided a layer to the conversation on how the EOAS department interacts with and contributes to the broader discussion and solutions to the climate emergency. So the colloquium kicked off with a discussion on, sorry, I forgot to breathe. The colloquium kicked off with a discussion on making research relevant in the era of climate change, followed by research advancements in climate solutions, and then the discussion focused on reducing fossil fuel emissions and how to mine for a sustainable future. And then finally, connected our work as scientists, the creation of effective policy. So we hope, given the context and the rich discussion provided in the previous weeks, this final week will be able to encourage reflection, discourse, and inspiration for defining our department's role in the climate emergency response. So before we hear from our speakers, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this colloquium on the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam Nation. And as a settler, I'm extremely grateful that I've been able to grow and learn on this land. And I would just like to give space for a moment of reflection on that. Okay, now so let's hear from our speakers. So we've all given you approximately 5 minutes to share. And then at the end of the session, we will have a combined question and discussion period. So for the audience, please leave your questions to the end or put them in the chat if you're in Zoom, and then we can refer back to them. So now I'd like to pass it off to Professor Andrew Weaver to start the conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here quickly. Boom, could you confirm that you're now seeing my screen? You should be seeing my screen. Somebody just say yes or a thumbs up. Yeah, I got a nod there from John. All right, so I just wanted to set the stage because I recognize that I'm not at UBC. I am an alumnus from UBC Math and Oceanography there before it was became EOAS back in the 1987. I got my PhD, so I know the department very well, and it's nice to see some familiar faces like Christian Oriens. I see was there, and she was there when I was there back in the day. I want to just set the broader stage because you do have experts from UBC who can talk about specific solutions at UBC. I'm trying to approach this both as a scientist and also as the former leader of the BC Green Party and as one of the architects of British Columbia's Clean BC Roadmap 2030 BC and most recently, as of today, Economic Plan for BC. The issue that we're dealing with, and one of the reasons why this is such an important issue to deal with now as opposed to tomorrow, is the issue of global warming. One wherein the people who make the decisions today and the decisions that are made today won't have to be lived out or lived by or experienced by those who are making said decisions. For example, if we look at the warming expected in store over the next couple of decades relative to 1986 to 2005, it's relatively insensitive sensitive to the emissions trajectory that we're expecting in the years ahead. However, as we move to the latter part of this century, the decisions we make today and the pathways of future emissions have a profound effect on the climate system we leave behind. So the overarching question here, and I'll just leave that, is, and in fact, boiling the whole notion down of global warming is, and whether we should deal with it, comes really down to one question. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment we leave behind? Yes or no? If no, who cares about global warming? Because the decisions we make today aren't really going to affect the life of those who make the decisions today. However, if we do, and I think most of us do, the decisions we make today have a profound effects on the system we leave behind. So why should we care about global warming? Well, I'm assuming we do care about intergenerational equity. And given that we do, the two biggest profound ramifications of global warming are widespread species extinction, which is ongoing, and geopolitical instability. That is, the seeds of discontent have been sowed by the developed world, and yet the impacts of climate change disproportionately affect those who don't have the economic wherewithal. And so this can sow the seeds of geopolitical instability. If we look at emissions with time, they've gone up despite myriad international agreements, including the Paris Agreement, which frankly is destined to be a failure unless we get to deal with the issue of border tax adjustments, which we can talk in questions, as well as the notion of perhaps a minimum carbon price. We're starting to see those negotiations happen in Canada and internationally. And so there is some enthusiasm and excitement in this area, particularly that it looks like the World Trade Organization and others will become part of the discussions, which would ensure then that if you put protectionist carbon barriers on your boundary, you're not taken to international court. The notion of 1.5 degrees, some of you will worry about it. So what I've tried to set the stage is this is a really big problem. Decisions we do today have a profound effect on the intergenerational equity aspects of this problem. However, things that I don't think we should be hanging our heads on is the notion of trying to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, because we can't. The reality is that this narrative of we have 12 years to limit climate change arose from the 2018 IPCC report. It's led to things like global warming clocks. But what this has done is set the younger generation today up for giving them a sense of false hope and setting it up for failure, because even the day that this report was announced, it was not possible to make 1.5 degrees. The scientific community knows that and has known that. The problem is it relied upon hypothetical emissions that didn't exist in the future. But that doesn't mean that there's anything special about 1.5 degrees, and steps we can take today actually make a difference. Every 1/10 of a degree we avoids a 1/10 of a degree of climate impacts moving forward. And that is why this issue is so empowering, because there are solutions everywhere. Each and every one of us are part of the problem, and therefore each and every one of us can be part of the solution. And those solutions fall in 3 categories: technological, behavioral, and market instruments. Your other speakers will talk more about what specifically UBC is doing. It's quite exciting to watch from across the water at the efforts that are being led out of UBC. It really is quite inspirational for me to see that. I'd argue that climate change, to summarize then, presents the greatest opportunity for innovation, creativity, and economic prosperity the world has ever seen. And the reason why I say that is every environmental challenge could actually be can be seen through 2 lenses. One is the lens of the despair and hopelessness you see from it, or the other is the lens of opportunity you see in terms for innovation, in terms of dealing with it. I mean, the tack I like to take, and that's why I'm so impressed with what your student group is doing at EOAS there at UBC, is instead of focusing on the hopelessness of the problem, focus on the solutions, because that is empowering and it leads to opportunities for innovation in reducing emissions as well as negative emissions. And I won't talk about that book right now. My advice to those seeking solutions is look to your governments to fill niches and gaps there, because there is money available both provincially and federally to assist with those solutions. We have in BC Clean BC, which was designed to target the big pieces of the pie in the BC emissions data. And we have the subsequent roadmap to 2030, which was released last year, which again focused even more on specific aspects of these. And the reason why I put these up is to say, number one, any UBC EOSA specific solutions might be thought of in the context of what the federal and provincial governments are doing. And what we have done provincially is to focus on the biggest pieces of the pie, which for BC is transportation, because 40% of emissions from household emissions in BC are from transportation. Today, BC announced the final final component of its climate plan. And it's an issue that we've been pushing for a very long time, because a climate plan isn't a climate plan, it's actually an economic plan. And that was announced today at 11 o'clock, and it's very exciting. And it's an economic plan that realizes that prosperity in British Columbia tomorrow is based on us recognizing that climate change provides the opportunity for innovation. It's really very exciting. And I'll leave it at that and say that the international science community has done their job. Now it's governments worldwide to do theirs. And I truly believe we've reached a tipping point in public opinion. We've seen Greta Thunberg able to galvanize not the radical activist element, but mainstream society to actually call upon the political establishment to start to deal with it. And for the first time in my life, I'd be the climate scientist who got my PhD at UBC in 1987, have been working on this problem for a very long time. For the first time in my life, I see real efforts being made both provincially, federally, and internationally. And my final advice is to those young people in the audience. It's really important to tell people what you don't like, but it's also really important to tell people what you do like. Politicians are people too. Far too often, the people mobilize and tell and fight what they don't want, but they don't know how to actually tell people what they do want. And when they get what they want, they're not there to support the political establishment to deliver into the promise. So the whole notion of dealing with this requires solutions, but it requires cradle to grave support, not only for the change, but the implementation of the solutions. And with that, I'll stop and thank you. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you're planning to do at UBC. And according to mine, I was 7 minutes exactly, because you said 5 to 7 minutes. So I was 7.
Thank you so much for that. That was a great addition. Okay, we're gonna pass it off on to Claudia Rutenberg now. What do you think?
Thank you very much, Emma and the other organizers, for the opportunity to contribute to this panel. I'm not going to show you any slides. I'm just going to give you some ideas in 4 different categories. 3 types of education that UBC offers, and one way of thinking about education that we don't talk about very often, but I think is worth bringing into the conversation. I want to say I'm joining you from Salt Spring Island on the shared traditional and unceded territories of the Halkamenim and St. Charleston speaking Coast Salish peoples. My area of focus in the Department of Educational Studies is philosophy of education. And from that angle, which includes questions about what education is and what it is for, I want to focus on 2 of the questions that the panel organizers provided. The first is, what are the roles and responsibilities of university researchers, educators, and universities as institutions in responding to the climate crisis? And the second is, how can and should we build a unified, coordinated, and effective climate response across research, teaching, outreach, and operations activities at a place like UBC? So if I distinguish 3 types of education that students experience at UBC and other post-secondary institutions that all have relevance to the climate emergency, I'd say the first is specialized formal education. And then we can look, for example, at the specialized programs that UBC offers in climate-related disciplines and fields, things like environmental sciences, environmental engineering, and natural resources conservation. And of course, one of the questions we can ask there is UBC offering enough of those programs? And I don't know enough about the programs offered by other faculties to venture an answer, but I can say that in the case of my own faculty, education, I would say we're not doing nearly enough. So there's definitely room for improvement in specialized formal education that UBC offers in areas related to the climate emergency. The second type of education, which I actually think is more interesting to talk about because it spans the entire university, is general formal education. It's the kind of education that would lead us ideally to say about everyone with a UBC degree that they are an educated person, regardless of the specialized program they have completed. Universities typically have breadth requirements, that ensure that all graduates, regardless of their specialization, have certain knowledge, skills, or attributes. And those breadth requirements tell us something about what a university values in the attributes of its graduates. At UBC, for example, if we look at undergraduate students in the Faculty of Science, they must take a minimum of 12 credits in the Faculty of Arts, not including any English courses used to fulfill the communication requirement. And the communication requirement is an interesting one to sort of look at the kinds of things that are valued. And a question we could raise here in this area of general formal education is whether something like ecological literacy should be considered a minimum requirement these days for calling someone an educated person. And perhaps for that reason should be considered a requirement for all UBC graduates, regardless of their specialization. Now, the third kind of education students experience, in addition to their specialized program in this general education, is the informal learning that happens by virtue of them being at UBC, being on campus, in UBC buildings, using UBC food services, communicating with UBC faculty and staff, and so forth. I'm not going to speak to what UBC does in its operations because that is John Madden's area of expertise, but I do want to name it specifically as an area of informal learning and an area in which students can experience some discrepancies. What I mean is that UBC as a whole is a teaching institution, and we know that do as I say, not as I do is not a very effective teaching method. So for example, if students are learning as part of their formal program, specialized or general, what kinds of emissions are generated by, let's say, air travel, and what the relative contribution of those emissions is to ongoing global warming. And at the same time, they hear their professors talk about the international conference they attended. And, it wasn't a very good conference, but at least it was an interesting place they hadn't visited before. Then this informal learning undermines their formal education. I'm aware that UBC includes the reduction of air travel for academic purposes in its current climate action plan. But unfortunately, there is no mention of the role of tenure and promotion criteria, and thus of academic governance that affects these kinds of habits. Until faculty, and in particular pre-tenure faculty, are rewarded and not penalized for limiting the number of international conferences where they present their work, I'm concerned that the change in academic culture and habits will be far too slow. Now, let me end with some comments about how UBC speaks about the education it seeks to offer in the current strategic plan, 2018-2028. And in particular, in the area of transformative learning, the strategic plan states, quote, "A rapidly diversifying economy, social context, and job market demand a different kind of education, one with a greater focus on competencies and transferable skills, such as critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, and one that promotes and supports continuous learning." Now, I don't want to say these are bad things, but I want to add something to this, and that is that UBC in the business not only of shaping competencies and transferable skills, but also of shaping desires. And I'm borrowing this idea from the Indian scholar Gayatri Chakravarti-Spivak, who wrote about education, and specifically education in the humanities, as, quote, "an uncoercive rearrangement of desires," end quote. Now, she proposed this idea in a more specific context, and in the interest of time, I won't discuss that context. But my point is that the phrase uncoercive rearrangement of desires can also be understood as a more general description of education. Because education, regardless of the social position of the student, and regardless of the particular field or discipline of specialization, affects not only what students know or are able to do, but also what they imagine, attend to, understand to be desirable, and desire for themselves and others. If we believe that what is needed is an uncoercive undermining of human habits and desires that lead to ecological destruction and degradation, including the current climate emergency, then a rearrangement of desires, simply changing what people want and what they no longer want, becomes an important part of the education UBC offers. Maybe this is part of some of the specialized programs, but I think more importantly, it should minimally be part of the general formal education of all UBC students and be supported by what they're learning informally by being at UBC. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. There was definitely some things brought up that I had not considered. So I'm going to welcome Tara.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for being here. Okay, so I'm going to start honing in a little bit more into EOAS, but also some of the things that are going on at UBC in particular. I'm going to fog up. That's going to be fun. And a few of us that are coming later are all referring back to some of these same things. So maybe I'll spend a moment talking about them. But you know, the climate emergency declaration is going to be something that the next few speakers are all going to be referring to in different ways. So, but what I think about here is actually what's happening right now, and how is UBC taking action on climate change. And one of the things that was a big motivator of all of the stuff that's going on right now was the declaration in 2019 of the climate emergency. And so there's some language here, but that really kicked us off into a whole process. Oops, it's not going to change for me. It's going to make noises. Nope. Okay, is this going to work now? Okay. Michelle, who's speaking later on, was co-chair of this process. That really involved people all across UBC, right? So thousands of people were participating in surveys and forums and discussions that all culminated in a report that sort of laid the stage for what UBC wants to happen, and these 9 recommendations that came out of that process. And so there's a variety of things going on in here intersecting with other priorities on campus, but you can see that there's a big focus on climate justice, institutional leadership, engagement with Indigenous perspectives into the climate initiative, expanding and strengthening research on climate research at UBC, fostering a climate of engagement and advocacy on climate action, supporting community well-being, expanding climate education opportunities, both on campus and for the broader community, developing and strengthening partnerships, and accelerating emissions reductions. So John, who's coming after me, is going to be focusing a lot on that one. And I'm going to touch on a couple of these other ones that are in here, just to show, demonstrate actually how EOAS is already engaging in these areas, whether you know it or not, and some of the ways that UBC is supporting those initiatives. So my role, so I'm faculty here in EOAS and director of the environmental science program, teach many of the environmental science courses, but I'm also half-time as the academic director of what we're now calling the Sustainability Hub. Up until last week was called the Sustainability Initiative. And so the role of the Sustainability Hub in some ways is both to support actions on campus around sustainability and a focus on climate, but also to showcase and highlight some of the things that are going on, reporting on the activities of others on campus. And one of the places that you can find out about what's going on campus and how we're reporting is on a website that's dedicated to this. So there is a climate emergency at UBC website, and you can find the final report in here and the recommendations. But also if you scroll in here, you'll see a lot of the activities that are going on campus that we're trying to showcase, and also to hold UBC accountable really for meeting the needs of the declaration, of making a declaration like that. So some of the things, sorry for all of my text, I see some of my speakers afterwards have much more pretty pictures, but I did want you to actually see in depth some of the things that are going on in here. Again, talking about under the recommendation of demonstrating institutional leadership, a lot of activity around divesting, and Michelle will be speaking to that later on, but also mobilizing funds and money that is distributed on campus for activities. A lot of it is student driven and student focused activities. But a lot of this is coming into also through educational renewal, right? And insertion of climate into your classes in different ways. So another recommendation, expanding and strengthening research at UBC. And some of these activities you can see on these progress bars are still starting. Some of them are farther along in the progress bars. We have a new Center for Climate Justice on campus that's being driven by Naomi Klein, who's joined geography as a faculty now. And so this is nascent and coming up. I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more about them in the future. Faculty of Arts has been focused on hiring in this area. So faculty clusters coming in that have a focus on the climate emergency. And one of the things that EOAS was contributing to and part of organizing Rachel was on the organizing committee, was the Climate Change Research Symposium that happened in October this year. Hopefully that will be a continuing effort. I don't know if you have insight on that, but I'll ask you about that. Yeah. So, and then this one here about education. So many of these also are places where EOS is highlighted, of course, because we really, as earth sciences all broadly, have a real deep research interest and education interest in climate. So the Climate Studies and Action Certificate was jointly developed by us here in EOS and colleagues in geography. And that's right now, it's going to be going to Senate and should be on the books for students to enroll in September. So that's almost at the progress bar. The Climate Teaching Connector is a program that is organized by the Climate Hub, which is in the Sustainability Hub. And the Climate Teaching Connector is an opportunity for grad students to showcase their research and expertise in climate in other people's classes. So as faculty or as instructors and course instructors on campus, you can make a request for one of these climate experts to come to your class. So it's a really nice way of having interdisciplinary sharing around climate. And the grad students get paid for that work. Climate education grants. So these are $5,000 grants, and we have faculty in EOS who have used these for upgrading. So Phil had one for upgrading 340 and Stephanie for 112. So revising and bringing in climate content into courses. The Climate Justice Research Collaborative right now is helping EOS, I think, assess opportunities for offsetting faculty travel, right? So that's an opportunity, sort of like a directed studies. Essentially, students get credit for that activity, and it's a project that has a community partner. In this case, the community partner is our department. And there's a collection of climate courses, and of course, EOS is highly represented in here. So if you go to the climate change course website that collates and makes visible and attractive all of the climate courses on campus, you can see that we have a number of our courses showcased in here. And if anybody's teaching a course and feels like they want it on here, they should let me know, because we can just update this at any point in time. So there's other things available through the Sustainability Hub that can enhance the activities in EOS and other departments around campus. Again, some of these opportunities for funding to bring climate focus into your classroom, larger opportunities for innovative research on campus. So up to $50,000 for research projects that have this sort of scale up opportunity, right? Let's try it on campus, check it out as a sandbox, and maybe it has a larger impact. Grad students, there's summer internships where you're focused on sustainability and climate projects. And right now that we have a 3-year focus on the Fraser Estuary, which might be more interesting, will have a role for EOS grads in a way maybe that in the past there hasn't been. They've been more focused on urban work. And of course, undergraduates, lots of leadership and training and projects there. So I don't want to take too much time more, but just let you know that the Sustainability Hub has its website, sustain.ubc.ca, and there's a special standalone site for the climate emergency. And I think that's it. Is that it? Yeah, that's John. Okay, so that's the end for me.
Okay, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Emma, and all the organizers for pulling this forum together. I know how much work goes into these. It's a real pleasure to share with us today and our recent efforts in advancing climate action planning at UBC and some of the significant contributions made by students, staff, and faculty in the development of this plan. I find these sessions really helpful just to learn and understand the great work that is happening across our university. But most importantly, just how universities, we use our intellectual and institutional capacities to catalyze positive change, to drive innovation, and help in the rapid deployment of technologies and approaches to accelerate our efforts on climate action. I always like to kind of reference, what 2030 means in days. To Andrew's point, I think we have a steep cliff ahead of us. But I think it's a sobering reminder about the urgency of what we're doing, and the clock is ticking. We have less than 3,000 days to make deep impact and make that change quite positive. I like to show this graph with less than 3,000 days to 2030. We have this kind of collective sense around the importance of accelerated action. And I show this diagram to illustrate the role of catalysts as part of the chemical reaction to actually support a quicker reaction time using less energy to achieve faster results. And part of the university system, we have this opportunity to be the catalysts and enablers to accelerate progress to achieve deeper carbon reductions in a shorter time span while expending less resources and time to achieve those results. A call to action really bubbled up with mobilization of students at the UBC climate strike on September 27th, 2019. I think many of us were part of that. These strikes across the globe saw millions of people united together in sending a strong message to government, to business and broader society that we need to act, and we need to act urgently. As a result of that student mobilization and targeted protest, in December of 2019, as Tara noted, UBC declared a climate emergency and has since committed steps to alleviate the effects of climate change. And UBC has always been at the forefront of responding to community priorities and being active in the climate action space for more than a decade. With the declaration came the commitment to establishing the climate emergency engagement process, as Tara noted, 9 strategic priorities, which saw over 4,000 people participating in forums, pop-up surveys, virtual discussion groups on topics ranging from climate justice, divestment, campus partnerships, teaching, learning, research, and campus operations. Community input formed the basis of recommendations that were developed by working groups and the Climate Emergency Task Force members during the summer and fall of 2020. And that was during the time of COVID, when much of this was actually done virtually. It basically assembled into 9 strategic priorities, presenting a bold vision for UBC's climate emergency response. And one of those 9 strategic directions was to accelerate deep GHG reductions through an update to the climate action plan. So concurrently, during the climate emergency process, the Climate Action Planning 2030 process was launched, taking that community input gathered through the community emergency engagement process, establishing expert working groups to form and tackle some of the key emission areas identified in the university. And those emission areas are really kind of categorized into traditionally scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1, the direct emissions from buildings and energy shown in green on the screen here. But what you see here in terms of the scope of the climate action plan is scope 3, the extended emissions associated with commuting, food, business travel, embodied carbon, waste and materials. And as you can see, the proportional representation in blue represents the biggest impact areas. So this was a new focus of the climate action plan, given the potential impacts that we can have in reducing those areas. So the Climate Action Plan 2030 set really bold and ambitious targets for the university, 45% reduction, collective reduction in emissions for extended impact areas, which I noted, which is commuting, business air travel, food, waste, embodied carbon. The other thing is around the scope 1 and 2 emissions. So an 85% reduction by 2030 and net zero, absolute net zero by 2035. So that's taking that 2050 original goal that we had set for the university in terms of net zero and moves it up 15 years. So incredibly ambitious. For the purposes of this presentation today, I'll focus more on the extended emission areas. So again, it's around commuting, business air travel, building life cycle or embodied carbon, solid waste materials, and sustainable food systems. So we're targeting a 45% reduction by 2030 to align to the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees pathway. This will include deep reductions in all of those respective areas. So I'll touch on each of them really quickly. The commuting target by 2030, we're targeting to achieve a 45% reduction in commuting emission areas. The key actions in this area include embracing remote working, flex days, e-learning, things that we're already doing today. Implement a sustainable transportation levy, which we already started implementing on parking permit fees. And we're taking those that transportation levy and reallocating to sustainable access for different groups on the campus. We're exploring a transit subsidies to support service and custodial staff that are in most need of support. We're taking funds from the sustainable transportation levy to create an entire sustainable transportation program to deliver infrastructure and programs to support cycling, van pooling, ride sharing using electric vehicles, and our continued pursuit of a rapid transit connection to UBC. In terms of waste materials, by 2030, UBC will apply a circular economy lens to enable a 50% reduction in waste, progressing to a zero waste community. Key actions in this area include a zero waste action plan update for 2021, which is already in midstream. Expansion of our zero waste foodware strategy to help eliminate single-use items like paper coffee cups, plates, and plastic utensils. Updating our sustainable purchasing and procurement policies to align with our zero waste goals, and supporting programs to support food waste recovery and link it to the distribution networks and food service providers that are providing affordable and healthy food options for students in need. Food systems. So by 2030, achieve a 50% reduction in GHG emissions reductions associated with food systems. And key actions in this area include developing a food climate action strategy that includes a supplier code of conduct for new procurement guidelines, enhance and streamline measurement and reporting of food system GHG emissions, implement climate-friendly food labeling that is already in implementation with some of our food outlets on campus. And just the realization that food is a major area in which UBC can build an understanding of the role that we as individuals can make. And the food that we consume generates emissions through its production, packaging, transportation, storage, preparation. And of course, there are opportunities to lower emissions by reducing our food waste. The Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, of the United Nations estimated that if food waste were a country, it would be the third highest emitter of greenhouse gases after US and China. So a significant opportunity for reductions there. As Claudia mentioned, business air travel, by 2030, we want to reduce business air travel emissions by 50% from pre-COVID levels. We've actually, because of the situation that we've been in for the past 2 years, we're actually meeting that goal. But what we're really concerned about is the rebound effect after restrictions are lifted. And so key actions in this area are really tracking and reporting our GHG emissions for all UBC business air travel, develop and implement an air travel emissions reduction program that supports, promotes, and use of virtual alternatives to address barriers and equity issues. There's also an opportunity to lever partnerships through our university network affiliations, including the University Climate Change Coalition, UC3, PICS, ISCN, in helping to advocate for incentives and guidelines that reduce the need for non-essential air travel. If the air travel industry were a nation, it would be the world's 6th most climate polluting. A person creates more climate damage in a few hours of flying than most humans create in years. So you can actually wipe out great efforts in terms of your climate action reductions with a single flight. UBC, in terms of fleets and equipment, will procure new vehicles and equipment that are zero emissions. Key actions in this area include establishing a zero waste or zero emission vehicle procurement policy, expanding UBC fleet management programs, and continuing to pursue fleet optimization, and developing a zero emission vehicle charging and maintenance strategy to support the zero emission vehicle transition. In engagement and outreach. So this is an important aspect in terms of empowering the entire community, and ambitious target there working very closely with the Sustainability Hub to actually achieve these kind of multi-aims of engaging 2/3 of our campus community in terms of being aware and actively contributing to UBC's climate action and climate emergency goals. And key actions in this area include creating a more integrated cross-campus communication and engagement management model to review, coordinate, and support campaigns for climate action. I'll just briefly touch on this last slide before handing it off. The overall approach we're taking to helping UBC units is to really embed climate action into unit plans, policies, and operations. And we recognize that the most sustained community change often occurs when departments or units self-assess, self-organize, and create unit-specific climate action plans in response, just as EOAS has, just a remarkable effort that this department has actually launched at their own accord. So this is something that we want to actually model in terms of this momentum that is built in terms of self-actualization and empowerment, and the sense that we're kind of using the same models that have been developed through the Indigenous Strategic Plan and the EDI Strategic Plan in terms of doing a self-assessment first. And we're going to be providing facilitation guides and templates to aid in that response, and really creating what's called unit climate frameworks that can be templates for different units and departments across the university to emulate. So we're not kind of repeating and kind of creating redundancy, and we're kind of building off the momentum of units and departments that have already been involved in this process. Just to end off here, I think organizations that empower its community to have a voice at the table allows us to have a better understanding of the issues and perspectives across the university. In the end, it enables us to be much more adaptive and resilient because there are more minds involved in the understanding of the problem and greater capacity and ownership brought to identifying solutions and achieving results. Universities are really in a unique position to help catalyze innovative approaches to addressing climate change. And I think we want to empower that change to happen, given that window of opportunity is slowly closing. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I guess Michelle is next.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Michelle. I'm a recent graduate of the EOAS department, specifically the Environmental Sciences program. And today I'm going to be talking about the advocacy that I was involved in as a student at UBC with the goal of highlighting to you the important role that students play in climate action at the university. So I want to start in 2017, when in the summer of my second year, I heard that UBC was creating a new strategic plan called UBC's Next Century. As the coordinator of UBC 350, which is now called Climate Justice UBC, I reached out to other student sustainability groups to see if we could collaborate to push for sustainability and climate action to be a top priority in this new strategic plan. We launched a petition as shown here on the slide, and we formed a group called the Sustainability Collective. We engaged hundreds of students in the strategic plan consultation process and met with the president and other members of the administration. And we were really excited to see the emphasis on sustainability and references to climate change in the strategic plan when it was released. But that was just the beginning for us. In 2018, we hosted a climate town hall inspired by the UBC strategic plan town halls for community members to come together and share their vision for climate action at UBC. At the town hall, the idea to push for a student-led climate hub was born. The next few months, we developed a vision for the hub and met with dozens of stakeholders, including members of the upper administration. Demonstrating the support of a wide range of stakeholders and building on the principles of the new strategic plan, we secured funding for the hub. In its fourth year, the hub has achieved many of the goals we initially set out and so much more. It has engaged thousands of students in climate action and created a rich and vibrant community for students to get involved in ways that match their skills and interests. So Tara already mentioned some of the programs that the Hub runs, such as the Climate Teaching Connector, the Climate Justice Research Collaborative, and they run many more, such as the Youth Climate Ambassadors program, which is a storytelling training workshop for high school students. So throughout this time, I was also involved in the divestment campaign. I joined the campaign in my first year, and at that point, it had already been going on for a couple of years. The divestment movement aims to remove the social license of the fossil fuel industry by forcing institutions that we have a stake in to take a stand. From 2013 to 2019, our campaign did everything we could think of to put pressure on UBC to divest. We passed 2 successful referenda, submitted numerous research briefs, convinced the student union to divest, held rallies, teach-ins, and open mics, collected thousands of signatures, wrote op-eds, sent letters, met with board members, and more. In return, we faced rejected meetings, false promises, constant new excuses, and never-ending hoops to jump through. But in the fall of 2019, as you've already heard, we hit a turning point. Building on the international momentum of the global climate strike, we organized a climate strike on campus and 5,000 people showed up. We used the strike to build support for an open letter calling on UBC to declare a climate emergency and take the necessary action to meet the scale and scope of this crisis, including divesting from fossil fuels. We collected thousands of signatures, and the next month we delivered the signatures and the letter to the president's office, and we secured meetings with the administration. We were also granted a presentation at the next month's board meeting, in which, in response to our advocacy, the administration submitted a proposal for partial divestment. This was a great step, but given the urgency of the climate crisis, we knew it was too little too late. Hundreds of students packed the boardroom calling for full divestment. And so after 7 years of campaigning, with hundreds, even thousands of students involved, we won. In December 2019, as you've already heard, UBC declared a climate emergency and committed to full divestment. As part of the declaration, we asked UBC to create a committee to develop a holistic climate emergency response. And as such, the task force was born, and I was invited to co-chair it. As you already heard, the task force produced a report with 28 bold recommendations, and this report was endorsed by the board and Senate last year. We've come really far, but there is still so much work to do to implement these recommendations. Currently, students are advocating for UBC to dedicate sustained central funding to implement the recommendations. So as you've heard from Tara, there has been funding put into the climate emergency recommendations, but that $1.5 million fund has just a 2-year timeline. So students are asking for long-term sustained funding. If UBC is going to live up to the declaration, it needs to put appropriate resources in. As you can see on the slide, we've already sent 17,000 letters from over 650 individuals calling for funding of the recommendations. So now, what are the lessons from this advocacy for the Climate Hub divestment and the climate emergency response? Some common themes are that, first of all, in all cases, students led the charge, pushing for action to go well beyond the status quo and face the reality of our current global situation. Second, there were always faculty and staff champions along the way who shared our values and supported us. And third, we always centered climate justice, the understanding that the climate crisis must be considered in the context of existing systems of social, environmental, and economic injustice. It's also not just the specific actions that we've won, but a shift in the way people understand climate on campus. In the recognition of the urgency of the crisis, the importance of climate justice, the value of involving students, and a belief in the power of the university to make a difference. Reflecting back to 2017, when we brought that letter to President Ono, it's amazing to think how far we've come. I'll be honest, there were times when it felt hopeless, when I felt like giving up, when it seemed no one cared and the challenge was too big or too complicated. I kept going because I saw how much this mattered to my fellow students. I didn't know then if we were going to be successful, but now I know. I know the power of students raising a call to action and staying committed until they win. This is why I believe that one of the best things the university can do to uphold the climate emergency declaration is to support student advocacy and engage with student ideas. Students have the dedication and ambition that we desperately need to face this challenge. Not just the challenge of reducing emissions, but doing so in a just way that creates a more equitable, democratic, and caring society for everyone. And so now I'd like to bring it home to the Earth Sciences Department. The challenge of the climate emergency demands that every single department and unit at UBC take action and integrate the task force recommendations. This is why I was so excited to hear that EOAS was creating a climate emergency response committee, and I joined the committee as an alumni. As usual, students are pushing to meet the challenge head on. I've been working with undergraduate students who are planning to submit a letter to the department calling for EOAS to center climate justice in the climate emergency response by fully implementing the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan, integrating environmental and social justice context into courses, phasing out partnerships with fossil fuel companies in line with the concept of just transition, and ensuring that mining partnerships respect social and environmental justice and community self-determination. We don't have time to go too much into this today, but I just want to encourage everyone in the department to get involved in achieving these goals. To the students here, I invite you to join us and engage your fellow peers in this conversation. And to the faculty, I also invite you to join us and to hear us out. I know the things that we're asking for aren't always easy, but the challenge of our present moment means we can't always choose what's easy. Students know this and are taking courage in diving into hard choices and hard conversations. We know many faculty share the same values and want to do the same. So let's work together and make it happen. And thank you. That is the end of my presentation.
All right, thank you so much from everyone. That was, those are all amazing presentations. So seeing that it's 5 o'clock, we're gonna get right into the discussion. Rachel, wait, do you wanna come up and kind of, yeah, okay.
Thanks. So Emma invited me to lead this discussion in lieu of Stephanie. I wanted to emphasize that I have had nothing in doing all the fantastic work of organizing this, so please don't credit me with any of this. I'm just here to help lead a discussion and yeah, see what questions you have. And so I don't know, a few thoughts that I had just to sort of summarize all of the fantastic talks that we've just heard. And that all of these initiatives that are coming out that are student-led, that have been taken on by the university, and Tara telling us about how the UBC Sustainability Hub and the work to keep UBC accountable to all of these targets that were then very well outlined by John. And I agree with Andrew when he said, you know, sort of climate research has perhaps done its job at this point in terms of defining what the problem is. And really the next steps are, what are the solutions and how do we center climate justice in that? And what are our responsibilities and the other ways that UBC can respond to this? And so I thought Claudia's talk was amazing in terms of thinking about how do we support ecological education to all of our students. And she gave me so much food for thought, was sort of education as an uncoercive rearrangement of desires. And then, yeah, I really appreciated Michelle's talk demonstrating really the power of student advocacy, the power that we have when we come together and push for these changes. And so I guess, right, I'm interested in whether there are any questions from the room. I'll try and keep a note on the chat as well. So if you have questions on Zoom, please either raise your hand or put them into the chat. Yoshi?
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps if you're, yeah.
But thanks for the
Michelle,
thanks
can
for
you
the
hear
talk.
Joshi? Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for the talks, everyone. That was really great. Tour de force of what's going on campus. And I really applaud all of you for your actions, whether it was you or you were vaguely involved. One issue I have, though, with the UBC Climate Action Plan, I went through it and I didn't see anything about coordinating with other universities to lobby policy at the federal government level. And it felt like to me that UBC's response is to primarily reduce its own carbon footprint of its community. And I think that's great. And we should definitely do that. We should strive to be a model for other communities as well and lead in those technologies and efforts. But isn't the fight also very big and global in the sense that we should really start partnering with other universities in Canada, talk about ways to build a unified academic front in our country and internationally to lobby all governments, not just Canada. And I haven't heard or seen anything about efforts like this in the UBC sphere. And I'm wondering, like, are we spending our energy on all the right things, or where's the power of UBC's influence? Could it also be thrown at the government directly?
That's it's a fantastic question, Yoshi, and I'll try to remark on it in terms of our relationship, in terms of the climate action plan, and some of the ambitions that UBC has set out in terms of the partnerships that it's established through the University Climate Change Coalition, which I had mentioned. So it's a partnership of 22 universities across Canada, US, and Mexico. In our role, so President Ono has taken a leadership role in that network to drive change on 3 levels: on the global, on the regional, and on the local. And I think you're quite right. We have to use our power as universities, our intellectual and institutional capacities to drive change, to share our lessons so that we're not kind of reinventing the wheel. So we can deploy technologies, systems, initiatives, social change, and learnings about that through our networks. And that's just one network. We have affiliations with the International Sustainable Campus Network that has representation across the globe, the U7 Plus, as well as ASHE and other networks. And you're quite right. I think this is the opportunity to kind of drive change, even more regionally through our PICS network. So the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, of which University of Victoria is part of that. And I think there's initiatives right now to start the conversations for more collaborations amongst the universities to share in our experiences to accelerate the change that is necessary.
Yeah, I'll just add to John's comments there that those are the active areas of discussion right now. So in addition to just recent conversations with PICS around how can the 4 research institutions in BC collaborate for collective action, we're also engaging more across Canada through McConnell Foundation support and engaging university presidents across the country. But there's lots in there that is still being worked out. And so I can reach out for anybody who has interest in getting involved in that area and trying to figure out how to focus the conversations and what the next steps might be. But I'm been meeting with people for the last 2 weeks about exactly that issue.
That's great.
If I could add, from a political lens, one has to be extraordinarily careful as an institution like UBC or elsewhere of being seen as an activist organization. It is a not-for-profit entity, and it is there to the best way UBC could actually show leadership is to do as I say, not as I, and actually demonstrate a success. That is the governments love to support success models. UBC could be approaching the feds, it could be approaching the province saying, look, as part of your Clean BC, your federal plan, which really are internationally leading. I mean, people will quibble about the details, but they are without a doubt some of the best climate reduction plans in the world. And say, how can we be leaders to showcase what universities can do? And there's money on the table. It needs the right asks have to be done to the right people for the right projects. And I think UBC has the potential to lead the country in this way if it asks the right people for the right money for the right projects. And so I encourage you to do that.
Thanks for your answers.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Mark, next question.
I want to preface it first by I'd like to commend the climate committee for putting together an astonishing 6-week theme. So maybe a round of applause. For a long time, I've never seen this kind of engagement. I have 2 questions, one for Claudia and one more for discussion. So, Claudia,
Sorry, could you come up here closer to the mic? People on Zoom can't quite hear you.
Claudia, thank you for quite an engaging talk. My specific question to you is related to what you see as the core elements of, I guess, how did you describe it? Not ecological education, but ecological literacy. What are the main elements? My second question, which is perhaps addressed more to Andrew in a broader discussion. work and collaborate a lot in the United States as well as here. The University of California and State University of New York are among the two biggest corporations in North America, and they go out of their way not to take a stand and apply pressure to the federal government on this topic. So my question is, and UBC hasn't done that yet either, should a mission of Tier 1 state schools be to engage in this discussion by applying financial stress to federal governments where they have to listen? Or if we can't do that, is a good thing to do to try and apply pressure to rich private institutions to do their bidding?
Well, I can take on the second one. I would suggest to you that one should be very careful at the institutional level, biting the hand that feeds you. And public institutions are very much subject to government funding. And having spent 8 years in the legislature, and most of that is provincial, I suggest that certain politicians have will take that very negatively, and actually there will be repercussions. And it shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. I would suggest the best way UBC could do it is to actually focus on the positive. Governments want to actually advance solutions, but they don't know how, and they want people to help them. So rather than putting pressure, fiscal pressure, honestly, you don't have the fiscal pressure because they have the fiscal pressure on you. Say, we want to be leaders. Help us be leaders. Help us help you by being leaders that you can point to. That's the language governments want, and there's money there to support that. Government, the notion of, this is why I put up my slide about shouting at the clouds. We don't need that anymore. We have federally and provincially okay, we have a nonsense about LNG thrown in there every now and again. That's going to take care of itself. It's never going to happen, but there are plans in place and they don't know how to deliver into them. Help them. UBC has a real potential here to gather a few odds and sods with it, maybe bring SFU and UVic and others with it, and go and say, look, we want to be leaders. This is what we want to do. This is how much it will cost. Help us do it. And we'll help you deliver into your commitments by doing so, because we'll showcase those technologies. You can point to us, you get credibility worldwide. Trudeau is going to make this his legacy. This climate action is Trudeau's legacy. And Canadian universities should recognize that. Climate action is John Horgan's legacy. We have a premier and a prime minister looking to leave a legacy in their last term, and climate action is that legacy. You cannot have a better opportunity, UBC, to go there cap in hand and say, help us deliver to help you deliver.
Well, as I've just been advised not to bite the hand that feeds me, I won't comment on whose climate legacy will or won't be there to celebrate. I will, however, comment very briefly on the idea that universities should be careful not to be seen as activists. They should also be careful not to see themselves as passive implementers of policies developed elsewhere. They very much have, as joint post-secondary institutions, a seat at the table when larger post-secondary policy is developed. And let's just say for a moment that for a while the discourse du jour was internationalization, and not just when there was real, good reasons to say we must join with international partners in certain research projects, but for a while there was internationalization for its own sake because that was just something we had to do. Well, post-secondary institutions can join together in that discussion to say, maybe internationalization is not a goal for its own sake. Maybe we're actually flying all over the place for no good reason other than the fact that, it's kind of a fun thing to do and it expands our horizons, but it's no longer justifiable. That's not to say we should stop with those research engagement internationally where that's really important, but institutions jointly can speak back to their provincial governments and say, how about we focus a little bit more on bioregionalism in those areas where it makes sense for a while, right? So that's sort of on that point of not just being a passive implementer of policy, you're also a policy actor where you speak back to the policy that's being developed. Now, on the question of eco-literacy, look, I'll give it with some caveat. I'm not actually completely fond of the eco-literacy metaphor of literacy, but let's just talk about the kinds of understanding that graduates need to have, not only of themselves as citizens, which is a really common discourse that's being used, national citizens, global citizens, That's common language. Not only as producers and consumers, that is participants in an economy. That's also really common language that's used. Our students have an understanding of that. Is it already so commonplace that all our students have an understanding of themselves as species and participants in ecosystems? I'm not so convinced that everybody does, and that is a common way of understanding ourselves. What would it look like for everybody to understand the role we play in the multiple ecosystems in which we participate, and then to act upon that understanding of that mutual interdependence, and the fact that those ecosystems impinge on us, but every single action we take also impinges on those ecosystems of which we are a part. I don't think that is currently part of the way we understand students and graduates. I don't see it in the language of competencies. And so that's part of what I would be arguing for in that general formal education and the kinds of attributes we're looking for in graduates.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claudia. And thanks, Andrew, for your thoughts